Have you ever felt like there's something missing from the story you were told about your faith? Like there's a deeper thread hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered? For many, the Bible is a familiar book. Names like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob ring with ancient weight. But what if the people descended from those names? The 12 tribes of Israel didn't vanish into the sands of history like we've been led to believe. What if their legacy didn't end in the Old Testament, but continues in ways few dare to explore? The scriptures speak clearly. God made an everlasting covenant with Abraham, passed it to Isaac, and then to Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. From Jacob came 12 sons, 12 tribal fathers, whose descendants would form the nation chosen to carry God's promises. That part of the story is anchored in Genesis. It's not speculation, it's foundational. And yet, somewhere between the parted sea and the pages of modern history, that lineage seems to disappear. Or does it? For generations, many have believed that the so-called lost tribes simply faded into obscurity. But what if they weren't lost, only scattered, buried under the weight of time, conquest, and silence? What if the fingerprints of Israel are still among us, hidden not only in old maps and ancient customs, but in living memory, in forgotten bloodlines, even in the struggles and longings of people today? We live in a world that is desperate for belonging. Many of us wrestle with questions of identity, legacy, and purpose. And yet the very answers we seek might be waiting in the dust-covered corners of Scripture, ready to shine again. If you've ever questioned who you are, or wondered where you fit into God's story, this journey may stir something deep within you. So take a moment now to support this journey. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell so you don't miss what's ahead. Because what we're about to uncover doesn't just challenge popular history, it reclaims a spiritual inheritance the world tried to forget. Let's begin. The covenant begins. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Long before there was a nation, there was a promise, not signed in ink or carved in stone, but spoken by the voice of the Almighty. In Genesis 12, God calls a man named Abram, later renamed Abraham, to leave behind everything familiar and walk into the unknown. I will make of you a great nation, God says, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. It's a promise not just of descendants, but of purpose, a calling that would ripple across generations. Abraham wasn't perfect. He questioned, he waited, and at times he doubted. But he obeyed. And that obedience set into motion a covenant so foundational that the rest of the Bible builds upon it. When Isaac is miraculously born to Abraham and Sarah in their old age, it confirms that God's promise isn't limited by human weakness or biology. Genesis 21 records the joy of Isaac's arrival, while Genesis 22 takes us to one of the most sobering moments in Scripture when God asks Abraham to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. It's a test, and through it, God not only affirms Abraham's faith, but seals the covenant with even greater clarity. Because you have not withheld your son, I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven. Isaac inherits that covenant. And through Isaac comes Jacob, the man who begins life grasping at his brother's heel, but is destined to grasp something far greater. His story is marked by struggle. He deceives, he flees, he wrestles. But in the dark of night in Genesis 32, Jacob contends with a divine being and refuses to let go until he receives a blessing. It's here that his name is changed to Israel, meaning he who struggles with God. And it's from Israel that 12 sons are born, each one destined to father a tribe, each one carrying a piece of the covenantal promise. These aren't abstract figures. These are real men with real stories flawed, chosen, shaped by both hardship and hope. The tribes of Israel are not a distant myth. They are the living branches of a tree planted by God Himself, rooted in promise, watered by obedience, and meant to bear fruit that blesses the nations. But every tree, no matter how divine its seed, faces winds. And the question lingers like a shadow over this sacred family line. What happens when a people born of covenant forget the one who called them? What happens when prophecy begins to shape destiny in ways no one expected? A prophetic foundation, blessings that shape destiny. As Jacob, now Israel, approached the end of his life, he did something remarkable. He gathered his sons not simply to bid farewell, but to speak words that would echo across generations. In Genesis 49, we find not a father's last will and testament, but a prophetic unveiling. These were more than blessings. They were revelations, divine insights into the character, future, and spiritual legacy of each of the 12 tribes. And imagine the scene. An aging patriarch surrounded by his sons, speaking over them with a clarity that only comes when one stands between time and eternity. To Reuben, his firstborn Jacob speaks both honor and sorrow. "You are my might," he says, "but unstable as water, you shall not excel." Reuben's reckless choices cost him the preeminence that custom and birthright would have guaranteed. His tribe would later fade into relative obscurity, a reminder that position without integrity cannot carry destiny forward. Then Jacob turns to Simeon and Levi, brothers, bound by blood and violence. Their anger, once poured out in vengeance, brings a sobering judgment. They would be scattered among the other tribes. And yet, in an astonishing turn of grace, Levi's descendants, though once cursed for violence, would later be chosen for the priesthood. This reversal reminds us that God can redeem even the darkest parts of our story for His purposes. Judah's blessing stands out like a crown. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. With these words, Jacob declares that kingship will come through Judah's line, a prophecy fulfilled in King David and ultimately in Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Judah's legacy becomes not only political, but deeply spiritual, a royal thread that ties the Old and New Testaments together. To Joseph, the son once betrayed and forgotten Jacob offers words overflowing with favor. Joseph is a fruitful bough whose branches run over the wall. He speaks of resilience in suffering, strength in trial, and divine blessing that extends beyond borders. Through Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, the tribe receives a double portion, further confirming the favor Joseph carried even in exile. These words weren't casual. They were spirit-breathed, and while some were hard to hear, each was essential in shaping the future of the nation. They weren't just personal, they were tribal. And they weren't just tribal, they were prophetic. If Jacob's words tell us anything, it's that God writes generational stories. He weaves legacy through bloodlines, blessings through obedience, and even redemption through failure. But here's a question worth pausing for. Have we ever considered that our lives too might carry the weight of ancestral blessing or warning? What if part of your story didn't begin with you, but with someone who came long before? The seeds planted in Jacob's final moments would take root in a land not yet conquered. And when the tribes finally crossed into their inheritance, Those blessings would begin to bloom or wither depending on how they remembered their calling. But before they could settle the land, they would have to see it with their own eyes. And in the promised land, identity would become more than a name. It would become sacred ground. Into the promised land, inheritance and identity. After centuries of wading through slavery, wilderness wandering, and divine preparation, the children of Israel finally stood at the threshold of the promised land. But entering the land was not the end of their journey. It was the beginning of something far more profound. This wasn't simply about occupying territory. It was about receiving inheritance, about identity made visible, about covenant taking form in the soil beneath their feet. Under the leadership of Joshua, the tribes crossed the Jordan River and began to claim the land God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The conquest was not without cost. There were battles, struggles, setbacks. But eventually the time came to divide the land. And here in the book of Joshua, something sacred unfolds. God commands the land to be divided by lot, a process that may sound random, but in biblical tradition was seen as directed by the sovereign hand of God Himself. Each tribe received a portion not just of land, but of legacy. Judah received a vast territory in the south, a land that would later give rise to kings. From this tribe, David would rise, and through David, the Messiah. Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph, were granted their own inheritances, fulfilling Jacob's blessing that Joseph's lineage would receive a double portion. Ephraim's central position in the land later made it a dominant force in the northern kingdom. The tribe of Levi, however, received no single territory. Instead, God scattered them across cities throughout Israel. Why? Because their inheritance was not the land, it was the Lord. As priests and teachers, they were embedded in every region to maintain worship law and spiritual accountability. These territories weren't accidental. They were deeply symbolic. The land became a visible sign of God's promises, a daily reminder that this people was not only chosen, but called. And yet the land also came with responsibility. It required obedience, justice, and faithfulness. It was never meant to be just a possession. It was a partnership, a space where God would dwell among His people and where His people would live out the holiness He required. But even in those early days, the seeds of forgetfulness were already in the ground. As generation followed, generation memory faded. The tribes began to compromise. Worship was neglected. The land was taken for granted. And with that forgetfulness came fragmentation. Inheritance, once sacred, began to lose its meaning. Have you ever inherited something you didn't understand? A family story, a tradition, a name passed down without explanation. Without context, even the most precious gift can feel empty. The tribes of Israel were given more than land. They were given a calling. But when that calling was ignored, the cracks began to show. And so the very land that once testified to their identity would become the stage for their scattering. What had been promised could not be revoked, but it could be forfeited. And what followed was not just a political crisis, but a spiritual unraveling. Because when inheritance is forgotten, identity begins to disappear. And that's exactly what happened next. Scattered to the wind, exile, loss, and the rise of the lost tribes. The story of the 12 tribes doesn't end with conquest and settlement. In many ways, that's where the deepest spiritual conflict begins. For though the people had received the land, they struggled to remain faithful to the one who gave it. The covenant required loyalty, worship, justice. But over time, those obligations were neglected. And slowly, the nation fractured first in heart, then in form. After the reign of Solomon, Israel split in two. The northern kingdom retained the name Israel and included 10 of the 12 tribes. The southern kingdom, Judah, held the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, along with many of the Levites who had remained near the temple in Jerusalem. From that moment on, unity became memory, and division set the stage for devastation. In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire swept through the northern kingdom. Samaria was conquered, the people were exiled, and the 10 northern tribes were scattered across foreign lands. Assyria's strategy was calculated: remove a people from their homeland, resettle them among distant nations, and strip them of their identity. It wasn't just military conquest, it was cultural erasure. According to 2 Kings 17, the Israelites were taken to places like Halah and the Habor River, their roots severed, their names forgotten. Roughly 130 years later, in 586 BC, Babylon completed the pattern. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple burned. The southern kingdom fell. Yet unlike the northern exile, some from Judah would return decades later, rebuilding the temple, renewing the law under Ezra and Nehemiah. But the northern tribes, they didn't return. They became what history now calls the lost tribes of Israel. But here's the mystery where they truly lost. Scripture doesn't describe them as erased. In fact, it speaks of them as preserved. In Amos 9:9, God says, "I will sift the house of Israel among all nations, as grain is sifted in a sieve. Yet not the smallest kernel will fall to the ground." It's an image of scattering, but also of preservation. God is not blind to where His people go. They may be displaced, but they are never beyond His reach. Hosea 1 adds another layer. The prophet declares that the children of Israel, though disowned for a time, will one day be called sons of the living God in the very place where they were once told, "You are not my people." It's not just restoration, it's reversal. A return not only to land, but to identity. And this leads to a haunting question. Could the people we call lost have actually been preserved, hidden in plain sight, their lineage diluted, but not destroyed, their customs faint, but still alive? The Bible leaves the door open. It refuses to close the chapter, which means the story is still unfolding. What began as a covenant passed from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, scattered through exile, now waits for remembrance. But to remember, we must look beyond the pages of history books, because the next traces of these tribes may not be found in ancient ruins or forgotten scrolls. They may be found in the places the world never thought to look. Is this conversation helpful so far? Traces in the wilderness, where did they go? The silence that followed the exile of the northern tribes wasn't a silence of extinction, it was the quiet rustling of a people on the move. Dispersed, yes. Forgotten by man, maybe, but not by God, and not without a trace. Across continents and centuries, whispers of their presence began to surface in the most unexpected places, like footprints left in the wilderness, fading at the edges, but unmistakably human, and unmistakably Hebrew. Some of these traces are found in historical records, others in oral traditions passed down through generations. Still others appear in customs, dietary laws, and even languages that bear striking resemblance to ancient Israelite practice. Take, for example, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia. For centuries, they observed the Torah, practiced circumcision on the 8th day, honored the Sabbath, and celebrated biblical feasts without contact with European Judaism. They didn't adopt these customs from outside influence. They preserved them from within, claiming descent from the tribe of Dan. And they are not alone. Among the Igbo people of Nigeria, oral histories tell of an origin from Jacob. Their customs, such as ritual purity, the ark-like sacred box used in ceremonies, and the avoidance of unclean meats, mirror Levitical practice. Similarly, the Limba people of Sierra Leone have long claimed Jewish ancestry. And in recent years, genetic testing revealed something extraordinary. The presence of the Cohen modal haplotype, a unique priestly DNA marker shared among Jewish men descended from Aaron in a portion of their population. These aren't vague resemblances. They are echoes, faint but persistent, of a forgotten origin. Linguistic links deepen the intrigue. Words in Yoruba and other West African dialects show parallels to Hebrew vocabulary. Names of clans, deities, and rituals reflect a memory that refuses to fully die. How do we explain this? Coincidence, parallel development, or something more ancient, something buried, not lost? Even in Arabia and parts of Asia, records speak of Israelite groups absorbed into larger populations, yet retaining distinct traditions. Jewish communities in India, such as the Bene Israel and Bnei Menashe, trace their ancestry back to the northern tribes, keeping ancient songs and Sabbath observance alive for centuries, without Torah, scrolls, or written Hebrew. Why weren't these stories told? Why didn't we learn this in Sunday school or history class? Could it be that the lens through which we've read Scripture has been too narrow, too shaped by Western tradition to see what was happening outside its gaze? These people weren't wandering aimlessly. In many cases, they were fleeing persecution, seeking refuge, preserving what little they had left of their identity. Their survival wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. And even in unfamiliar lands far from Jerusalem, they remembered. They remembered the God of Abraham. They remembered the law. They remembered the name Israel. But the deeper mystery is not just where they went. It's why their story was hidden, and who decided to silence their voice. Because if their lineage remained and their customs endured, then this isn't ancient history, it's a living story. And we have to ask, who benefits from forgetting it? And who is being called now to remember, erased by empire colonial theology and identity loss? As the descendants of Israel scattered across continents, a different force began to rise, one not of exile, but of empire. Colonization didn't just redraw maps, it rewrote memory. It reframed identity. It reshaped the image of who belonged in the Bible and who didn't. Through European colonization, entire cultures were systematically stripped of their ancestral connections. The stories of indigenous peoples, including those who may have carried remnants of Israelite heritage, were deemed primitive or irrelevant. European artists reimagined biblical characters with pale skin and Western features, recasting ancient Middle Eastern patriarchs and prophets in the likeness of their conquerors. This wasn't just artistic preference, it was theological strategy. For centuries, colonial powers weaponized the Bible as a tool of control. Scriptures were filtered through Western interpretation, and doctrines were crafted to justify slavery, subjugation, and racial hierarchy. Entire seminaries taught that Africa was cursed, citing misapplied verses like Genesis 9 to strip away dignity and divine calling from an entire continent. In doing so, they erased not only the image of biblical figures who resembled the very people they enslaved, but the possibility that these people could be the descendants of those same figures. Laws were enacted to suppress Hebrew customs. In places where Sabbath keeping and circumcision were practiced, colonial authorities labeled them pagan or superstitious, erasing their biblical roots. Sacred oral histories were dismissed as folklore. Traditional names were replaced with European ones. And over generations, what remained was a hollowed-out identity shaped not by inheritance, but by survival. This wasn't just cultural loss, it was spiritual amnesia. But Scripture had already foreseen this erasure. In Deuteronomy 28, God warned that disobedience would lead to exile, scattering, and a loss of name and language. Yet he also promised restoration. In Amos 9:14, the Lord declares, "I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel, and they shall rebuild the ruined cities and inhabit them." In Isaiah 11, he speaks of gathering his remnant from the four corners of the earth. The question is not whether the tribes were lost. The real question is, who decided we should forget where they went? And if the truth was buried, why? Because when a people forget who they are, they become easier to control. And when they remember, they become impossible to erase. So if the story of the 12 tribes was scattered by conquest, suppressed by colonization, and silenced by theology, then the act of remembering becomes not just historical, it becomes prophetic. And maybe, just maybe, that remembrance has already begun. The remnant rises DNA prophecy and spiritual awakening. In our generation, something remarkable is stirring. What was once hidden is now rising quietly at first, but with growing boldness. Across continents, across cultures, scattered descendants of Abraham are waking up. Not to nationalism, not to pride, but to identity, to covenant, to prophecy unfolding before our very eyes. Science, once seen as a separate realm from faith, is now confirming echoes of the biblical record. Among the Limba people of Sierra Leone, researchers discovered a rare DNA marker, one found almost exclusively in Jewish priestly lines, the Kohanim lineage. These are not mere coincidences. They are genetic fingerprints that match the memory of oral traditions carried for centuries, through song, through ritual, through stories whispered beneath colonial rule. In Nigeria, among the Igbo people, similar markers appear. Alongside them are customs that mirror the Torah, circumcision, on the 8th day separation of clean and unclean foods, reverence for the Sabbath, and ancient names that sound strikingly Hebrew. These weren't adopted recently. They've been there, passed down like an ember in the dark, waiting for breath to ignite it again. Prophecy speaks to this moment. Revelation 7 describes a vision, 12,000 sealed from each tribe of Israel before judgment comes, before the great shaking. It's a picture not just of preservation, but of divine recognition. Isaiah 11 speaks of a second regathering of the remnant from across the nations. That second gathering cannot happen unless the remnant awakens, unless they know who they are. We're seeing that awakening now, not just through science, but through spirit. Across the African diaspora, from the Americas to the islands, from Europe to the Middle East, communities are returning to the Torah, reclaiming forgotten customs, and rediscovering that their struggle, their perseverance, even their displacement fits a pattern written long ago. And then there's Ezekiel 37, the Valley of Dry Bones. A vision of hopelessness, scattered, remains lifeless, forgotten. But the Spirit of God breathes. The bones come together, flesh covers them, and breath returns. It is the image of a people resurrected, not just physically, but spiritually. A people who once said, "Our hope is lost," now standing as an exceedingly great army. Could that be what we're seeing? Could these scattered truths, forgotten names, and broken lineages now be knit together by the breath of God? And more importantly, where do you fit into this story? Because prophecy isn't just about the past or even the future, it's about now. The remnant is not just remembered, it is being restored. They were never truly lost, only scattered like seed, not dust, hidden in plain sight, not erased, preserved across time, not forgotten. The story of the 12 tribes isn't just a tale from the ancient past. It's a living thread, still weaving its way through history, through bloodlines, through prophecy, and maybe through you. Because at its core, this mystery has never been about finding a map. It's about remembering a covenant, a calling, an identity that no empire could destroy and no exile could erase. The Most High doesn't forget what he plants. And when he speaks of a remnant, it is not wishful thinking. It is divine intention. In the place it was said, "You are not my people," there it will be said, "You are sons of the living God." Hosea 1:10. That promise still stands. And if you've ever felt like something ancient beats beneath your skin, if your spirit stirs when you hear these names, these prophecies, these echoes, it may be more than coincidence. It may be the voice of the shepherd calling his scattered sheep home. So take a moment, breathe this in. You are not alone in your questions. You are not abandoned in your journey. You are part of a story bigger than you ever imagined. If this truth stirred something deep within you, don't let it end here. Like this video so it finds others searching. Share it with someone who needs to remember. And subscribe, because we're only just beginning to uncover the Bible's forgotten mysteries together. Thank you for walking this sacred path with me today. May the Lord bless you with eyes that see the unseen, ears that hear his call, and a heart awakened to your true inheritance. Until next time, keep seeking, keep listening, and never forget, the tribes weren't lost. They were waiting to be remembered.